Okay, thank you very much, Lindsay. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to do a sort of roundup of the work of the last almost, not quite 50 years of working at Silchester. And I'm delighted that Jonathan Code is in the audience because, as I say to him regularly, it's all his fault. Because nearly 50 years ago, he wrote to me as a young, just newly appointed lecturer at Reading and said, would I be interested in helping with the conservation program by digging a small trench by the south gate? And that's where it all began all those years ago. So I'm going to try and give you a sort of sense of some of what I think the important achievements of the work that we've done at Silchester over the years. In a sense, like Gaul, you can divide it into three. The early years in the 1970s when, in a sense, it was very interesting work on the defences, but not perhaps making the advances that came later. And then there was a light bulb moment in 1977 when I suddenly realised that what everybody had told me about Silchester, George Boone and others, well, you won't find anything more there, it's all been dug out. I could see immense possibilities, and those possibilities were realised in the excavations on the Forum Basilica in the 1980s. So it's really, I begin with the Iron Age, and a topic which was much discussed in the 1970s, the origins of urbanisation in Britain, a famous British archaeological report, one of those red volumes about the origins of urbanisation in Britain and Europe. And that was a kind of stimulus to look at Silchester, where the antiquarians had been very much aware that there was a prehistoric past, but at the time their excavations finished in 1909, they really hadn't found anything to show that. So we begin with the familiar, to many anyway, the aerial view of Silchester, where you can see the Roman street grid, which overlies what we now know of the Iron Age town. You've got the town walls running around. You're looking from west to east. Taken in one of the last years before they stopped cultivation within the walls. It's now under permanent pasture. So introduction, and then really to begin with that remarkable achievement. By 1908, the Society of Antiquaries project to explore the entirety of a Roman town had been completed. They had one more season, 1909, to dig outside the walls, but essentially you have that achievement which is still reproduced and commented on now as the only, in inverted commas, complete plan of a Roman town, actually anywhere in the Roman Empire. But of course it's not complete. It has major deficiencies because it only shows buildings with masonry foundations, hard edges which the antiquarian trenches could locate. So they didn't recognize timber buildings. And going back to that observation about not finding the Iron Age, they had no ability to excavate stratigraphically. I mean, that technique really emerged in the post-World War II excavations in urban centres, London, Winchester, and so on. So there are major deficiencies, but yet that plan is still reproduced. But underneath it is the Iron Age town, which we've explored into what seem to be tiny areas. You see them there. What you have there is the Iron Age defence running around here. You've got the line of the later Roman town wall. See the line there. Some features that are identified from geophysics. And then the two trenches, Insula 9, and then the Forum Basilica. And it was the Forum Basilica excavation which was prompted by the observation I made back in 1977, which demonstrated that the Iron Age was there beneath the Roman, and an interesting succession of Roman occupation between it and the construction of the masonry public building, the Forum Basilica, in the early 2nd century. And then this over-ambitious excavation in Insula 9, only about a quarter of that insula, but it was an excavation which took 18 six-week summers to do, and this month we'll see the publication of the 5th and final monograph on that one excavation. But its objective was to explore, I suppose, what was the second really major theme, which is to characterize, the aim was to characterize how urban life changed between what I anticipated would find, in the light of the early excavation, the Iron Age at the bottom and the abandonment of the town in the 5th century or later. So we begin then with the Iron Age, which we'd discovered underneath the Forum Basilica, but here this 3,000 square metre trench gave the opportunity to see it in greater detail. Here's the area within Insula 9, major building just short of 50 metres long, a great hall, and then surrounded by clusters of pits and buildings all around, and set at right angles to the trackway running through, running northwest, southeast, so quite different from the alignment of the Roman street grid, and running northeast, southwest. So the first indications, again taken with the findings in the 1980s, that there was some degree of a regular layout to the Iron Age settlement. And Margaret Matthews' lovely reconstruction of how that might have looked at the end of the 1st century BC, beginning of the 1st century AD. So there's the great hall. And then subsidiary buildings, which she's represented as rectangular buildings, and I think that's likely, but we couldn't show that for sure. One might have expected roundhouses, and they eventually did come in the earliest Roman levels. So a view has a rustic feel to it, thatched buildings, the animals in and around the houses, the open spaces for growing garden crops and so on. And Silchester, at the end of the Iron Age, was one of the centres in southeastern Britain which had this remarkable network of trade links with the continent. It was a centre which drew in from southern Britain commodities like corn, cattle, the list that the geographer Strabo sets out, minerals, gold, silver, lead, hunting dogs, and of course slaves. And these were exchanged for luxury goods from the Mediterranean world, from Italy and from southern Spain, and a variety of products, most of which survive as ceramics, as pottery in the archaeological record, and these all coming into Calleva as they came into other centres in the southeast, most notably, I suppose, Colchester, Camaldunum. So this network, and within Britain, the tentacles of Calleva, located close to the Kennet, close to the Thames, but in a remote place, relatively remote, but access to these routeways going up the Thames Valley into Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire, westwards, the Kennet taking you into Wiltshire and towards Somerset. And some of the artifacts here I've kind of highlighted the coins from Camaldunum coming in from the east, salt from the Thames estuary, Kentish coins, Dorset or southwestern coins, Dubunic coins coming in, and then going out small quantities of these luxury goods, minerals, tin and copper from the southwest, and so on. And between the late 1st century BC and the Roman conquest or the Roman invasion of 43, Calleva really had control over a considerable territory of central southern England. And we know of 3 of its leaders, at least 2 of whom style themselves as kings, calling themselves Rex, Latin. Here's the first of those 3, a gentleman called Tincomarus, and the shaded area gives you an idea of how far his coins have been found in the south. So there's the 3 of them, and of course it was the 3rd, Verica, who appealed to Claudius for help because his territory was now being overrun by the Cacciavaloni from Colchester, and this gentleman, Caratacus, was in control of Calleva at the time of the Roman invasion of AD 43. So not so many coins, because Caratacus was probably only there for a very short while. But it's important, I think, to see it as a context for what we found in some quantity certainly in the Forum Basilica excavation, but also in Insula 9, of really lots of pieces of Roman military equipment. Here's just a sort of a random selection of some of the pieces from bits of broken armor, uniform, and so on. Brooches, a Hod Hill brooch on the left there. So this material appears in quantity in contexts which are around about the time of the Roman conquest. Now, is this equipment that was carried by the Atrebates or the Cacciaveroni, the followers of Caratacus, or is it equipment associated with the Roman army? And was Calleva one of the 20 oppida that Suetonius tells us was taken by Vespasian and his second legion around about probably AD 44? Well, very recently, and this is really results only just brought in, one of the things which attracted my attention from Insula 9 and then more recently the excavation of the bathhouse were the finds of pieces of disarticulated human bone. Some very distinctive, crania, but others, femur, tibia, and exceptionally, one example from the Forum Basilica of a complete male skeleton. But those finds and the realization that many of them came from contexts which, again, you can't be precise about this, but dated to around the time of the Roman conquest, led me to have the unstratified examples from Reading Museum, which they could pin down to a location within the town, and examples from my own excavations, unstratified from the backfill of Victorian trenches and so on. And there's a cluster of early dates, and this is their distribution from the north gate up here, in the ditch of the defence of the town, to the north, and then down beside the bathhouse, cranium and pelvis, a cluster in the Forum Basilica, including a complete male burial and other body parts, and one right out on the east. That's an ulnar, I think. Anyway, so there's a cluster, and as you'll see as we come to the end of the program, this is very different from the pattern of the later disarticulated human bone. And my assumption is, while some of them may have been treasured pieces brought into the house, and certainly in one case used as a foundation deposit, the majority derived from disturbances of casual burials within the town. Of course, at that time, formal burial would have been by cremation, and burials, as we know from Verulamium in the late Iron Age, took place outside the settlement area. So it's unusual to have them in the town, and the explanation for the fragmentation is due to the cycles of digging foundations, cutting into earlier rubbish pits and so on, and the bones getting broken up. So I suspect that there was a military siege of Calleva, and it was followed quite quickly by the construction underneath the Forum Basilica of the first Roman timber building. And there's been lots of kind of conjecture over the years about, was there a military presence at Silchester? And this building that we found in the 1980s has been, it's been the prime source of evidence. And it certainly is a military-style building in the way it's constructed. And I've suggested that it's part of a courtyard building, so extending round underneath the much later Roman Forum Basilica. So speculation that it might have been a headquarters building back when originally dug, that speculation discarded, and other thoughts coming in against the background where there's no clear evidence of a formal Roman military fort at Silchester, but I'm not sure that that really matters, because with a settlement of the size of the Iron Age settlement, there's plenty of opportunity for an army or a part of an army marching through to have itself quartered within the existing buildings within the town. So the fact there's no fort at this time of AD 44 or maybe even late AD 43 doesn't seem to me to matter. And so the function of this early building, I think more is to do with the management and control of communications from London to the west and the northwest. It sits almost at the junction of the north, south, and east-west streets of the Roman town, the later Roman town. It also, in a very kind of military Roman way, it rides right across the Iron Age grid. The Iron Age grid, remember, is aligned effectively diagonal to what becomes the Roman. This building, as you can see, is aligned north-south, east-west. So it sits on top of the Iron Age arrangement, so ignoring the Iron Age. And Calleva then here in the middle, this taken from the Ordnance Survey map, there's Calleva. You see it sits at the junction of the road running west. It's the first major settlement west of London. The roads then turn northwest towards Cirencester and Gloucester. They go due west to Bath and then to the crossing of the Severn at Sea Mills. They go southwest down to Dorset and then Exeter. They go south to Winchester, so Winchester here, and then Chichester just off the map at the bottom of the screen. And north, the road runs up through Dorchester-on-Thames, Alcester. Oh, I can't get it again then. Come back. There is Dorchester, and then Alcester, and then up here somewhere it meets Watling Street at Towcester. So a very important line of communication, and along those roads would have gone the supplies and the troops that were conquering the south of Wales, the southwest of Britain, constant movement, and our building, our post-conquest Roman military building in the centre, is, I think, something like some sort of mancio, which is to supervise and support the movement of goods and people through the town. And the town survives. This is the other unusual thing, because what's unusual for Britain and indeed for the Western provinces generally is that the Roman town lies on top of the Iron Age. One would expect, as you see at Colchester, that a virgin site would have been chosen. But I think, and this is again, I guess, a complete speculation, it's always assumed that Calleva was part of the client kingdom which survived the Roman invasion, the client kingdom of Cogidubnus, with the territories which were awarded to him for his loyalty to Rome. And so you have a situation where, let's suppose that Calleva was part of the kingdom, so technically his, but nevertheless with this presence to supervise and control the movement of goods and troops east and west, sort of compromise which led to the survival. Once planted, the Iron Age town survived and continued. So Silchester comes again into the historical sphere through the discovery of bricks of the reign of Nero, stamped with Nero's name. These tiles, one was found near the bathhouse in 1903-4, and you see a stamp tile, NER, CL, CAE, AUG, GER, some of the letters ligatured together. So that comes out as Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. And Nero, of course, was the second emperor, as far as Britain was concerned, 54 to 68. Now, we discovered some of these stamped bricks in the excavation of the Forum Basilica, and every excavation since then within the walls has produced more examples. So we have about 20 of those from within the town, and we've explored the tileworks where they were made at Little London, a sort of mile and a half south of Silchester. So there's no doubt that they're locally made, but Silchester is the only settlement where these tiles have been found. And I think if they were elsewhere, they would have turned up in the excavations at Winchester or Chichester, which also kind of lay within the client kingdom of Cogidubnus. They may still, but it's, if one thinks of the amount of work that's been undertaken in those towns since the 1960s, one would have thought that if they were there, they would have been spotted, but who knows. So these tiles, these bricks, were found in the public bathhouse of Silchester, which lies in the southeast corner of the town. Here's a view of the portico of the baths. So these are all bricks from Little London here and then the front elevation, and you can see the remains of the little columns which supported the portico, entrance through here, and in the distance the latrine, much enlarged later on. So there's the building of the bathhouse, certainly by the time of the reign of Nero, and also associated with this period is the amphitheatre. And the amphitheatre is unusual in that in its original construction, it has a circular arena. One would have expected, if one looked across at earlier examples, Pompeii obviously stands out, you'd expect oval or elliptical plan, but it's circular, and that's the date somewhere between the mid-50s and the mid-70s. So I think it belongs to this phase of Nero building. So amphitheatre, circularity, that recalls the training grounds, the gyrus that was first recognised at the Roman auxiliary fort at Badgington near Coventry. So circularity for training troops and horses. But what would be the context then in Nero's reign where there might have been a big burst of building which left its evidence everywhere we've excavated within the town? What might have led to that? I wondered whether it's actually something to do with the aftermath of the Boudiccan rebellion of 60-61. Remember that 3 towns, London, St Albans, and Colchester, were sacked, so they were in ruins. Nero sent his trusted freedman Polycletus to Britain to see what was to be done. And I just wonder whether, actually, given its position at the hub of this network of roads, he chose Silchester. And he brought, we're told, a huge retinue, which must have been largely a military retinue, to the island. And I think he had them doing a bit of smart building, so throwing up buildings within the town for what must have been a very short occupation of a matter of months, but also included constructing the amphitheatre, which otherwise was a very early development for the town. And the amphitheatre is aligned on what I call the Iron Age alignment. So there's the amphitheatre and the north gate you see in that image there with the big post holes for the structure of the north gate. And the later 3rd century arena wall. So we're not interested in that now. So there's investment in the town for whatever reason in the 50s or 60s, represented by the bathhouse and the amphitheatre. But within the town, if we take Insular 9 as a sample, this, what was effectively a quarter of one of the Roman insulae, one of the Roman blocks of the town, you can see that life continues pretty much as it had been in the pre-conquest period. You have a continuity of the lanes. So there's the main trackway coming up from the Forum Basilica Trench. These still continue in use. You have a mass of buildings. Here we have, for the first time, roundhouses with their clay floors. There's another one there. One's up here. And a smaller hall building down here, and rectangular buildings which seem to be facing the new. So here is the north-south road, later becomes a street, that runs down, goes past that military building at the crossroads. And its presence attracts to it these two buildings, one of which I think was a taberna, supplying food and drink to passers-by. So it's a bit of an incoherent, but it's quite densely occupied. All these clay surfaces represent the remains of building floors, and that takes us really up to the mid-80s. And the next slide gives you an idea. Again, Margaret Matthews' reconstruction, still a fairly rustic feel to the town, but you've got the roundhouses in the town, and then these buildings that front onto here's the north-south street down the bottom. Animals chewing, and one of these buildings produced, I think, our first flower pot. So horticulture, and one of the plants that may well have been growing in Calleva at this time is a herb like coriander. We'll come to that in a second. So a measure of continuity. The old trackways continue. There's this new north-south road. There's this mix of rectangular and circular architecture. There's quite a degree of continued consumption of imported goods from the Mediterranean and from Gaul, from France, and the community prospers. And this is the point, I think, to think about some of the changes that have been going on in the food that was being eaten, because one of the main strands of the Insular Line project was to recover as best we could the evidence from carbonized and waterlogged remains of the food types consumed, from sieving programs to recover the bird bones, the fish bones, the tiny bones that are difficult to recover by hand. So here you see what was already present before the Roman invasion. So we've got olives and coriander, celery, dill, and their actual equivalents on the right, and waterlogged contexts like this well down in the corner here was the place where most of these wells were the places where much of this evidence was discovered. So you have those, and that range of flavorings and food types continues to develop through the first and into the second century. It's broadened. So in the later first, early second century, we've got mulberries. We've certainly got figs if they weren't already in the Iron Age. We've got cherries. We've got lentils, and lentils with Mediterranean weevils in them, identified by Mark Robinson, but also local berries, seeds of blackberries, hundreds and hundreds of blackberry seeds, grapes or raisins, again imported, again coming from cesspits and wells from the early Roman town. So it's really rich and varied, and Insular Line, I don't think, was a particularly wealthy part of the town, but a lot going on. And then the meat. The population of Calleva enjoyed meat eating. This has been established through the work of Andre Colonnesi, looking at the residues of the pots from late Iron Age and the early Roman periods. Lots of evidence from eating the meat of beef, mutton, and also pork with some fish. And that's a contrast to what's going on in the, if you like, the wider countryside of Roman Britain, where dairy products were at the fore. So period naught is the late Iron Age, and there you see you've got lots and lots of beef, and I think that's probably affected by this brief military presence. They like their beef. And interestingly, every type of pot that's analysed, whether it's tableware or cooking pots, they all produce meat residues. So it got everywhere. Bit of pork, some chicken, and then wild beasties, not much of those. So going into the Roman period, there's a much more even split between beef, mutton, and pork. And of course, pork, as Margaret Matthews reconstructed, they can be raised within the town. Chicken's more popular, and also the wild beasties. And then there's the fish. So there's also quite a lot of fish. In fact, I think the commonest bone we have from the early period is of eel. Lots and lots of eel bones from the Kennet or the Thames, but a wide range of freshwater fish as well as some marine fish as well. So lots of fish, lots of meat, and then the savourings, the coriander, the dill, and so on. And here we have a sort of a picture of Calleva around about the mid-70s. So we've got the amphitheatre up here on its Iron Age alignment. We have the baths here, again, on an alignment which has to be adjusted when the Roman streets are eventually laid down. We've got the east-west street running through, the north-south, and our courtyard building, if that's what it was, here. And there's lots of rubbish. Oysters dumped right next to the building, mass of oysters, which the antiquarians commented on, a mass of cattle bone, another mass. So a fairly stinky sort of place, I think, at this period. And some hints of the beginnings of a temple building up here in the east of the town. So that's roughly how it was. And then we have really major change. This is the moment of transformation. It may have taken a while, but from the mid-80s, Roman authority, the client king, deceased, we believe, the kingdom is absorbed into the Roman province, and things are put to right. So the Iron Age lanes, trackways, whatever they are through the settlement are overwritten with this grid, the famous street grid of Calleva. That's laid down, it drives through properties, it takes account of no one, and it's laid down around about the mid-80s. And along with that is a replacement of the building in the centre with our first public building for the administration of the town and for the dependent county, the civitas. So this is our timber forum basilica of the mid-80s, again found beneath the floors of the later stone building. This is the stone building shown in outline that comes later. This is what we found in the 1980s. So timber public building, this is the hall, the basilica, altar, and then going through probably to the sacred Ides, the temple here, the shrine on the western side. Again, this is just conjecture of how it might have looked. So new public building, straight grid, imposed on the Iron Age settlement, and presumably there was no consultation with the planners beforehand. And this goes along with the creation of the administrative canton, the civitas of the Atrebates. This is roughly how I think it would have looked. So it's probably easy to conjecture where the boundary between the Atrebates and the Belgae was. It's roughly halfway between Silchester and Winchester, and then Silchester and Chichester. And the Thames, I think, was the boundary to the north, running round. And of course, for those of us who live in what used to be Berkshire, old Berkshire, this is remarkably similar to the pre-1974 county of Berkshire. And I see that there's still a campaign to bring back what is South Oxfordshire back into Berkshire. So that's the civitas, administration, Roman, all change, all change. And that change is reflected in buildings within the town. And we see an early response from the excavation in the 1890s of a townhouse in the southern part of the town, where the excavators found clear evidence for a timber building. This is one of the few instances where they recognized timber building, because this mosaic, which you see here, was, as it were, boxed within the remains of timber slots around it. So, timber building. But the point about this is that it's aligned north-south. It's on the alignment of the Roman grid. It must be early, late first, early second century. Can't be sure, but that seems likely. And then it's replaced by this masonry house, which will be mid-late 2nd century onwards. But back in Insula 9, there was some resistance to change. So you've got conformity down there in Insula 19. Insula 9, and this was one of the reasons for choosing this insula, was to explore why there were buildings in the town which were oriented about 45 degrees different to the street grid. And here you have how it looked between the mid-80s and the mid-20s. So you have this Iron Age alignment reasserted very distinctively. Townhouse here, flanked on one side by store and kitchen building. ERTB, by the way, early Roman timber building, okay? And at the other end, a circular building, which I'll come back to. The Iron Age lanes have gone, but property boundaries are established on their line, so you have a new property boundary here with another building fragmented. And again, these are all clay floored, so the yellow represents the clay flooring of the buildings. And down here, you've got a couple of buildings, one of which comes up at 45 degrees to meet the now newly laid, formalized north-south street. And it has this adjustment to where it meets the street. And another building behind it, and then there's another property division down here, but that property also follows the same northeast, southwest orientation. So you've got 3 properties, all of which have their buildings on the same Iron Age alignment. And whether that's just to say that's how we want it to be, or a deliberate provocation to the Roman authorities, who knows? But it's an interesting contrast, and of course you don't find this anywhere else because the Roman towns were built on fresh ground. And let's look now then, with reconstructing daily life, a major theme of that Insula Line project, let's look at 2 of the buildings in that area. So early Roman timber building 3, see the circular foundation here for it, traces of early phase of clay floor, a plan of one of its phases, clay floor, a great big hearth in the middle, entranceway leading out to the southeast. So looking like an Iron Age roundhouse, but of course circularity is not alien to the Roman way of building. And what's inside it is, I think, particularly interesting. Lots of offerings of one sort or another. So we have a neonate burial in the eaves of the property. We have a complete Silchester Roman jar, broken and then buried carefully in a pit. We have the cremated remains of at least 1, possibly 2 sheep, which had been deliberately burnt after they had been, the meat had been taken off the bone. And so again, another pit or 2 with these remains, and a range of finds which include a range of medical instruments, the best of which preserved is this scalpel. So this is where the steel blade would have been clipped in, and this is what's called a blunt dissector, which is for investigating areas of the body, I'm not sure which. Anyway, nicely preserved scalpel, and nicely, and this is for the men in the audience, a male catheter, a nice S-shaped piece of bronze tubing, lovely flexible bronze tubing there, which of course when we found it in this trench, thought, oh, it's just a bit of bronze tubing. But Nina Crummy, who's done so much work on the finds from Insula 9, says it matches catheters from surgeon sets from northern Italy very nicely. So male catheter, medical instruments, but also in this house and around it, lots of stelae for inscribing on wax tablets. So the broad end for rubbing out what was there before, and the pointy end for writing your messages. These are iron and fairly badly corroded. But altogether, you have this mix of medical instruments and writing instruments, which, when you plot out, there's a great cluster of these in and around the building. So medical instruments, stelae everywhere, deposits of complete brooches. It's a real mix. So you've got all these, the burial, the cremated bones, the complete pot, medical instruments. So what is it? And we suggest that this is a healer's house. So there's both a practice of medicine in the house, but also perhaps teaching as well, the two going together. So this combines as, the consulting rooms, the first surgery of Calleva, and also a school for teaching people Latin, presumably, and how to write it. So numeracy and medicine. And then you ask yourselves, where did that knowledge come from? Had the people who had this property in the late first century, had one or other of them served in the army and learnt about Roman medicine in the army? Had they picked it up from traditions within British society? Lots of questions. But clearly, as you think in this developing Roman town, how important a grasp of Latin would have been and writing it, and also command of numeracy. So this going on in a dedicated roundhouse at the edge of the one end of the townhouse. Then across the courtyard, you've got this extraordinary building which runs up against the north-south street with this frontage, this peculiar frontage. And this is a remarkable building which starts its life. It's timber built, probably had originally a thatched roof. It starts its life with a foundation deposit of a polished Neolithic flint axe that's buried carefully in the first floor of the building. And then it takes on a remarkable life, which is rather crudely summarized by these sort of figures to give you a sense of this small building, of how much stuff it produced. If I begin with bits of broken tile that were used to make the floor firmer, to fill up subsidence, that kind of thing, nearly half a ton of broken bits of tile in the floor. These weren't from the collapsed roof. This is just stuff brought in to stamp in and firm up the surface. Nearly 2,500 sherds of pottery, with quite a high representation, 13% of drinking vessels, jars for cooking, quite a lot of glass, bowls rather than beakers, but bowls that could be used for drinking. So that's, at this time, that's quite an interesting amount of material. And lots of bone, mostly very fragmented and unidentifiable. So 625 identifiable bones from the various deposits. And you see the colours here, the different colours represent different layers, different soil types. It was an absolute nightmare to excavate this building. And as you'll see in the next slide, we probably only actually recognized, a tiny proportion of all the different layers that were in it. So when we looked at some of the profiles, looked at the stratigraphy, the microscopic stratigraphy of some of the profiles, you can see here you couldn't recognize in hand digging some of these individual contexts. And the microstratigraphy, again, gives you that sort of feeling of how that building, how it worked or didn't work, because you get subsidence, you get muddy areas where the doorways are, and collapsing doorways and roof leaking reflected in the muddying of the different sediments that are revealed through these sections of soil, microsections through different parts of the house. So here you've got this doorway and a leaking roof. But it was obviously heavily used, heavily used. No other building of this period has that kind of evidence. And again, to make that point, here you've got a big blob. This is, we tried to get a sort of a grasp of the elements in the soils of different phases of the town, and it probably worked best for this period, the late 1st, early 2nd century. So this is phosphorus, which is a good indicator of refuse, human refuse, just general rubbish, animal bones, that kind of thing. And there's a massive score, if you like, for our building here. What comes closer to it is our round building, where you can imagine quite a lot going on, creating the right environment for whatever surgery might have taken place in the building, and whatever concoctions were brewed up on that hearth to ease the the pain or help cure the victims that went in there. So what we have here, I think, is it's a continuation of the building that it replaced, but it's a very active, vibrant tavern, again, feeding the traffic on the north-south street. Despite its absolutely the vileness of the building inside, it was very popular. So 2 glimpses of the town in the late 1st, early 2nd century. And the early 2nd century is when a town again gets a kind of grip of itself in terms of investment in public architecture. So we had the late 1st century street grid and the first Forum Basilica. That's then replaced sometime between 125 and 150 with this splendid masonry Forum Basilica, which dominates the town. There's the great hall of the Basilica, the courtyard, the Forum here. And it's a view you're looking westward. There's the main east-west street, full of McDonald's and Costa Coffees and all that sort of thing, Starbucks all along here, and the north-south, or a north-south street running down here. So it gives the impression of an orderly town, the tiled roofs. You have to ignore at this period that the town wall wasn't actually built then, but this is the best, this English heritage reconstruction is the best I think one can offer. Lots of open green spaces, but again, you know, there are no obvious timber buildings showing because they weren't discovered in the 19th century. So a view of the town, and it's true to say that from the early mid-2nd century, the digging of pits, the disposal of rubbish within the insula seems to die away. It's only when a well is abandoned that it's then filled with bits of rubbish. But there seems to be a policy of helping to clear the town and to remove those piles of rubbish that we saw in the town of AD 75. And the bathhouse is rebuilt. Here's a view of it in 1903-4, excavations and viewed across Tepidarium, looking across to the northeast. You can just see the Silchester Church Tower over here. So very big total excavation, leading to one of the most sophisticated plans of the Antiquaries excavation. This is their plan of the 1903-4 project with the different colours representing what they saw as different phases of the town. And sometimes that's correct, but what they actually missed was the original bathhouse, which they plotted some of the walls of which foundations, but they didn't actually put 2 and 2 together and see that actually what they had here were 2 bathhouses and a second one much enlarged. So again, we looked at this over 4 seasons, 2018 to 2021, and it again became as a revelation as to what a re-excavation of this building could tell us about the bathhouse, its environment, and the materials it was constructed of. So this is just a view of the caldarium of the later bathhouse under excavation with the columns, the pili that supported the floor, the hot air flowing in between, in around those stacks of tile. So bathhouse rebuilt on a more ambitious scale, almost doubling in size. The building of temples in masonry. We can't assign deities to any of the buildings we know as temples in the town, but we do have, on the one hand, you've got Serapis, kind of reference to the Egyptian fertility god, and then something perhaps more local inspiration, the so-called flute player, this little bronze figurine found in one of the houses by the antiquarian excavators. So Serapis on the left, of Portland stone and a bronze flute player. But we don't know for sure where they were, except this was perhaps a house goddess. And a little look at a temple on the eastern side of the town in 2017 added a 3rd temple to the 2 which dominate the eastern end of the town. So here's the cellar, the shrine of the temple, with a great votive pit which contained masses of building material, including Nero tiles, and then the outer wall around here and coming back round there. So a new addition, and then giving this remarkable eastern end. So as you came to the town from London, you would have seen these three great temples. Maybe they were 20, 30 meters tall, who knows? But they were massive constructions, great landmarks of the town. And within the town, the 2nd century is the phase where timber turns to masonry. This is a common sequence elsewhere in southern Britain, the replacement of timber buildings with here, townhouse in Insula 9, its flint foundations being revealed, and a complete example from the northern part of the town, Insula 27, with its suite of reception rooms here, with their mosaics, now in Reading Museum, here enlarged suite of rooms, tile floors, hypercourse here, one heated room for shore up here. And clearly, re-excavation of this, again, would tell you, give you a much richer story of how this house developed over time. But we don't have that story from the antiquarian excavations. So the town prospers. I suppose the period between the early 2nd century to the late 3rd century was the town at its height. Probably Britain was probably at its height at that time. And then things changed remarkably in the late 3rd century. And I've concentrated mainly on the early story because it's so rich, and one can obviously recover much more of that story in the future. There's so much more to find. But to sort of bring the end into focus, the construction of the great town wall, late 3rd century, is probably the largest and the last major investment of public works in Silchester. And its construction is remarkable. You see it there with its courses of flint, which is to be found quite locally, down towards Basingstoke, and then the slabs of stone, the string courses, which come, I think one of the remarkable things about the town wall, come from all over the countryside. So you've got stone coming in from the Weald, from the east. So this is the chalk and the flint from a few miles to the south, but you've got Portland stone coming in from around Swindon. You've got limestones coming in from North Oxfordshire, Gloucestershire, all this pouring in to construct this 1.5 mile long city wall, a stupendous undertaking at the end of the 3rd century, and choosing stone for the string courses against brick, although there's plenty of clay and probably plenty of timber to have used brick, as you find commonly in town walls elsewhere. So there we have, as it were, bringing that 1908 plan into play again, with the town wall now prominent. The amphitheatre outside, it wasn't presumably considered worth adding the extra expense of bringing it inside the walls. So there it is, and a view of the town. Green spaces that may or may not have had timber buildings within them, tile buildings which may or not have had tiles but might have had thatched roofs, and indeed some of them had stone slate roofs. Again, stone slate brought in from some distance. And that there is significant change in the late Roman period. And again, Insula 9 is a kind of clue into that, because you see the demolition of the townhouse that dominated that insula from its construction first in the late 1st century, its reconstruction in stone in the 2nd, and then its demolition in the mid-late 3rd century. And the insula given over to these small shops and workshops, so artisanal accommodation, the ones that we found, aerial photography revealed these, and then these taken from the antiquarian plan down on the main east-west street. And probably these gaps probably had buildings within them as well, but one would need to excavate again. So there is significant change. And within that context of change of the late town, again, from this recent look at the disarticulated human remains, and in total contrast to the early pattern, you have this great cluster of disarticulated human remains from the North Gate, mostly crania, and there's another example from the West Gate. So it's all at the edge of the town, maybe displayed on the gates of the town, with just one example only, a mandible from the dark earths outside the bathhouse, dating to in the range between the mid-3rd and the mid-5th century, and one of them almost certainly 5th century in date. So two clusters, one early and this late, and sort of bringing us face to face with, I think, the much more difficult times of late Roman Britain. And that is in contrast, I think, to the story that might be told about the Ogham stone, which was found in Insula 9 in 1893. It's a reused dwarf Roman column. You can see the mouldings here of the original stone and shown in the drawing to the right. And it's lost its capital, but you have inscribed on it a name in Celtic, and that name is Tebecatus, and these horizontal scorings against the vertical axis, the groups of them represent different letters of the Latin alphabet. So they're using the Latin alphabet, but the language is Celtic, and it commemorates Tebecatus, and on this side, the description of his tribal affiliation and his family affiliation, but we don't have any names. It's just Makimukoi up here, of the son of the tribe of. So this was found down a well in 1893, a well in the backyard of this really humble property here in Insula 9. So this is the backyard of this property, which certainly continued in use into the 5th century. And Ogham is not thought to have originated much before about 400. So you have a situation where you have a tradition which begins, as you'll see in a moment, in southern Ireland around about 400, here represented by a single find, quite remote from other finds of Ogham in Britain as opposed to Ireland. And so what does it represent? Does it represent one of a community, perhaps is this an Irishman, a migrant from Ireland, a contrast to the migrants into Britain from the Roman world of the East at the beginning of the Roman period? Somebody must have been able to read that inscription, and one assumes it was probably here on the street at one point, saying, "This is my house," this is for the postman, my house in Insula 9. So was there a community? And was it here in the 5th? Was there still a life going on of some sort in a town which otherwise had lost its kind of rationale with the end of the Roman Empire in the 5th century? Was there a community that survived here before the whole shift of the community eastwards to where the Doomsday village of the 11th century existed around the Church of St. Mary? So and I think it's a great contrast to the rather grimmer story of the crania that were found at the North Gate and the West Gate. So put that Ogham in its context. So this is where you find lots of Ogham in the south of Ireland, scatter to the north, a fair few in South Wales, rather fewer in Cornwall and Devon, and here is Silchester. And of course, if you think of it in terms of possible movement west to east, as long as the Roman roads were usable, passable, you could see that it made sense if somebody wanted to get from Ireland into Britain or across the continent, it made sense for them to come in almost now, sort of the A40, the A4, M4, go to London and on to Richborough. So maybe there is this hint of Calleva as a staging post in these twilight years of the 5th and 6th century. But it's hard to believe that really anybody was living in the main part of the town by the mid-7th century. Well, that's a completely sort of quick overview of Calleva, and I'm sure it's time to bring it to a close, but I'll just end with an advert for this exhibition, which is the the first exhibition of finds from Silchester ever to be held in Hampshire, because Silchester is in Hampshire, not Berkshire, but it's Berkshire and Reading Museum which holds the antiquarian collections. But it shows at least some of the finds from the work of the last 50 years, and it's in its full extent in the Willis Museum in Basingstoke until the end of April. Then a small part of it is taken to Christchurch and then on to Andover. But haste ye to Basingstoke to see the full exhibition. But thank you very much for listening.